Before we begin tonight's journey, I invite you to settle yourself comfortably. Let your body sink a little deeper into whatever surface holds you. Feel the weight of the day beginning to lift from your shoulders, from your mind, from the small tensions you've been carrying without quite noticing. There's nowhere you need to be just now, nothing that requires your attention. The world can turn without you for a while. Take a slow breath, if you like. Let it fill your chest gently, then release it just as slowly, as though you were letting out a long, quiet sigh. There's no hurry in any of this. No particular way you must breathe, no posture you must maintain. Simply allow yourself to be here, in this moment, with nothing expected of you beyond rest. Tonight's story will take us to a small corner of Victorian London, to a place where lamplight glows softly against the evening dark, where the sounds of the city grow muffled and distant, where time seems to slow to the pace of careful, practiced work. We'll spend our time in the company of quiet routine, of familiar tasks performed with steady hands, of the gentle rhythm that comes when the day's demands have eased and the night offers its particular kind of peace. There's no urgency to this tale, no mystery that must be solved, no danger approaching. It's simply an evening like many others, unfolding in its own unhurried way. Let my voice carry you there, and if you find yourself drifting away from the words, drifting toward sleep, know that this is exactly as it should be. The story will be here, a gentle companion, but sleep is the true destination. So settle a little deeper still. Let your eyes close if they haven't already. Feel the softness beneath you, the stillness around you. And when you're ready, we'll begin. The tailor's shop stood on a narrow street just beyond the bustle of Covent Garden, its frontage modest and unassuming, the sort of establishment one might pass a dozen times without particular notice. The building itself dated from the previous century, its brickwork darkened by decades of London smoke, its windows small and set with old glass that caught the light in uneven ripples. By day, the shop served its steady clientele, gentlemen of modest means seeking repair work, alterations, the occasional new waistcoat cut from reliable cloth. But it was in the evening hours, after the last customer had departed and the street outside had grown quiet, that the shop took on its truest character. Tonight, as on so many nights before, a single lamp burned in the front room, its flame steady behind clean glass, casting a pool of warm light across the work table. The lamp oil was good quality, purchased with careful economy, chosen for the clarity of its light and the evenness of its burn. It sat on the corner of the table in its accustomed place, the brass base polished to a soft gleam, the glass chimney free from soot. Around it, the room held its familiar arrangement, the cutting table in the center, its surface marked with the faint impressions of countless chalk lines and the occasional pale scar from a blade pressed too firmly. The tall cabinet against the far wall, its drawers holding thread sorted by color and weight, the dress form standing silent in the corner, its canvas body shaped to the measurements of a gentleman no longer living, kept now from habit and a kind of affection for useful things. The tailor himself sat on his work stool, his posture upright but not rigid, the result of decades spent at this same task. He was a man in his middle years, his hair thinning at the crown, his hands marked with the small scars and calluses particular to his trade. His name was Mr. Tennyson, though few called him by it anymore. To his neighbors he was simply the tailor, a designation that suited him well enough. He wore his own handiwork. A waistcoat of dark gray wool, precisely fitted, its buttons covered in the same fabric, and a shirt of plain cotton, its collar and cuffs showing the crisp edges of careful pressing. His sleeves were rolled back to the elbow, revealing forearms that, while not muscular, possessed the wiry strength of constant, precise motion. Before him on the table lay a gentleman's coat, spread open like a patient under examination. The fabric was a deep brown wool, quality material though showing its age, the nap worn smooth at the elbows and along the edges of the pockets. The coat belonged to Mr. Aldrich, a clerk in one of the banking houses nearby, a man who brought his garments for repair with apologetic regularity. This particular coat required new lining in the sleeves, the old silk having torn at the shoulder seam and frayed beyond simple mending. It was the sort of work Mr. Tennyson had performed thousands of times, work that required no great skill but rather patience and attention, the willingness to sit with a task until it was properly done. He had already removed the old lining, carefully unpicking the stitches that had held it in place for years, setting aside the pieces to use as patterns. The new lining lay ready, a length of serviceable cotton in a shade of tan that would wear well and show less soil than the original silk. He had cut it earlier in the evening, taking his time with the measurements, checking twice before putting blade to cloth. Now came the sewing, the steady rhythm of needle and thread that would occupy the next hours. Mr. Tennyson threaded his needle by feel as much as sight, the gesture so familiar his hands seemed to know the path without instruction. The thread was strong cotton, doubled and waxed to slide smoothly through the fabric. He tied off the end with a neat knot, positioned the lining against the coat's interior, and began to work. The first stitches established the seam at the shoulder, tiny precise stitches that would bear the stress of movement without showing on the coat's exterior. His needle entered the fabric at an angle, caught just a few threads, then emerged again, the motion fluid and economical. Each stitch was placed with the same care as the last, the spacing even, the tension consistent. There was a meditation in it, a quieting of the mind that came when the hands knew their work so thoroughly that thought became unnecessary. Outside, the street had settled into its evening stillness. The shops on either side had closed an hour ago, their proprietors retired to rooms above or homes nearby. Occasionally footsteps would pass, their rhythm absorbed by the fog that had begun to gather, turning the lamplight in the windows to soft halos. A cart rolled by, its wheels creaking, the horse's hooves a muffled percussion. Then silence again, or near enough, the kind of silence that a city achieves when it pauses between the day's business and the night's various other activities. The clock on the mantelpiece marked the hour with a gentle chime, its sound barely disturbing the room's peace. Mr. Tennyson glanced up briefly, noted the time more from habit than necessity, and returned to his work. Time held little urgency here. The coat would be finished when it was finished, each stitch given its due attention. Mr. Aldrich would not collect it until Saturday, 3 days hence, and even if he arrived early, Mr. Tennyson knew the work would be done. It always was. The lamplight caught the needle as it moved, a tiny flash of silver with each upward pull. The thread whispered through the fabric, a sound so soft it might have been imagination, yet present nonetheless, a small voice among the evening's quiet sounds. Mr. Tennyson's breathing had fallen into rhythm with his work, slow and even, each breath taken in the pause between stitches, released as the needle descended. His shoulders were relaxed, his expression calm, the small vertical line between his brows the only indication of his concentration. The shop around him held the accumulated character of years. The walls were paneled in dark wood, their surface marked by the occasional nail hole from displays long since removed, the finish worn pale where hands had touched in passing. Shelves ran along one wall, holding bolts of cloth wrapped in paper and labeled in Mr. Tennyson's careful hand, black wool suiting, grey worsted, brown tweed. Each bolt represented a kind of possibility, the potential to become something useful and well-made, though for now they simply waited, patient as the dress form, as the measuring tape coiled in its drawer. A small coal fire burned in the grate, more for comfort than warmth on this mild autumn evening. The coals glowed a deep orange, occasionally shifting with a soft sound, settling into new configurations. The fire had been banked for the night, given just enough fuel to last through his working hours without requiring attention. Its light added to the lamp's glow, creating layers of illumination that softened the room's corners and made the ceiling beams seem to recede into a gentle darkness. Mr. Tennyson completed the shoulder seam and moved to the arm side, the curve where sleeve met body. This required particular care, as the stitches here would be visible when the coat was worn, a thin line showing at the join. He selected a finer needle from his case, threaded it with matching silk, and began again. Each stitch was placed with deliberate precision, following the curve of the coat's original construction, maintaining the garment's shape and drape. His fingers moved with practiced certainty, holding the fabric taut but not stretched, guiding the needle through paths established by years of similar work. The rhythm of the evening continued, marked by the needle's movement, the occasional shift of coals, the distant sounds of the city finding their way through walls and windows. There was no conversation, no voice beyond the small sounds of work and the building's own quiet settling. Mr. Tennyson had grown accustomed to this solitude, had come to prefer it even. During the day, the shop required a different kind of attention, customers to greet, measurements to take, discussions of fabric and style and cost. But in the evening, with the door locked and the shutters drawn, the work became purely itself, untethered from negotiation or social grace. His thoughts, such as they were, drifted without landing, touching briefly on tomorrow's tasks, a collar to be repaired, buttons to be replaced, then moving on to nothing in particular. This was the gift of routine work, the way it allowed the mind to rest while the hands continued their careful labor. There was no problem to solve here, no decision to make beyond the placement of each stitch, and even that was determined by practice and the fabric's own logic. The new lining began to take its place within the coat, the tan cotton lying smooth against the brown wool, its stitches nearly invisible, the work revealing itself only in the way the sleeve regained its proper shape and weight. Mr. Tennyson worked his way down the seam, his pace neither hurried nor slow, simply steady, the accumulation of small, careful actions that would, in their sum, restore the garment to usefulness. Outside, the fog had thickened, pressing against the windows like a presence seeking entry. The lamplight pushed back against it, creating a boundary between the shop's warmth and the street's damp chill. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, its sound reaching the shop as a muffled echo, more felt than heard. The evening was settling deeper, drawing closer to true night, though within the shop this progression mattered little. The lamp would burn as long as oil remained, the fire would glow until the last coal crumbled to ash, and Mr. Tennyson would continue his work until it reached its natural conclusion. He paused to rest his eyes, looking up from the close work to let his focus soften. The room around him came back into clarity, each familiar object reasserting its presence. The scissors hanging from their hook, the thimble resting on the table's edge, the cabinet with its many small drawers, each labeled in fading ink. These things had been his companions for years, some inherited from the tailor who had trained him, others acquired piece by piece as his circumstances allowed. They were not beautiful objects, but they were right, each perfectly suited to its purpose, maintained with care and respect. His gaze returned to the coat, to the work that waited. The second sleeve would need the same attention as the first, the same patient application of needle and thread. He flexed his fingers briefly, feeling the slight stiffness that came from holding the same position, then picked up his needle and continued. The stitches accumulated, one after another, each adding its small contribution to the whole. The work had a kind of inevitability to it, a sense that this was exactly what should be happening in this moment, in this place. Outside, the world continued its various turnings, people moving through fog-dimmed streets, conversations occurring in distant rooms, decisions being made and unmade. But here, in this pool of lamplight, time seemed to slow to the pace of thread drawn through fabric, to the gentle rhythm of work performed with quiet competence and no audience but the surrounding stillness. The fire shifted again, sending a brief warmth across the room. Mr. Tennyson felt it against his back, a small comfort that reminded him of the seasons turning, the way autumn evenings carried a different quality of air than those of summer, cooler and somehow more substantial. Soon enough winter would arrive, bringing its particular challenges, fingers stiff with cold making the fine work more difficult, the cost of coal rising, customers delaying repairs until the worst of the weather had passed. But those concerns belonged to future evenings. Tonight there was simply this: the coat spread before him, the needle moving through fabric, the lamp burning steady, and the quiet satisfaction of work well done. He completed the first sleeve and laid it aside, taking a moment to examine his progress. The lining sat neatly within the coat, the seams straight and strong, the stitches nearly invisible against the fabric. It was good work, the kind that would last years without requiring attention, the kind that justified Mr. Aldrich's return to this shop rather than seeking out one of the larger establishments with their faster service and lower prices. Mr. Tennyson took pride in this, not in any boastful way, but simply as a craftsman's recognition of standards met and maintained. He reached for the second sleeve, positioned the new lining, and began again. The evening deepened around him, the shop holding its quiet vigil against the night. The lamp continued its steady burn, the flame neither growing nor diminishing, maintained in that perfect balance where fuel and air met in sustained illumination. The wick had been trimmed that afternoon, a small task performed with the same care as all others, ensuring that tonight's light would be clean and bright, free from smoke or flicker. In this, as in all things, Mr. Tennyson had learned that attention to small details prevented larger difficulties, that a moment taken for proper preparation saved many moments of frustration later. His needle moved through the fabric with a rhythm that had become almost unconscious, each stitch placed by hands that knew the work more deeply than thought could express. There was a kind of conversation happening between his fingers and the cloth, a dialogue conducted entirely through touch and pressure and the slight resistance of fabric yielding to thread. The cotton of the lining had its own character, different from the silk it replaced, more substantial and less willing to drape, requiring a firmer hand and slightly larger stitches. Mr. Tennyson adjusted without thinking, his hands reading the material and responding with the appropriate technique, knowledge accumulated across decades and stored not in memory but in muscle and nerve. Outside, the fog had grown so thick that the window glass showed only a diffuse gray, the street lamps reduced to vague suggestions of light, the buildings opposite rendered invisible. It was as though the shop had become unmoored from its surroundings, floating in some indeterminate space where only lamplight and the work at hand possessed any reality. The thought was not unsettling but rather comforting, a sense of being enclosed in a small world whose boundaries were known and manageable, whose contents were entirely familiar. The clock chimed the half hour, it sounded a gentle reminder that time, though slowed, had not ceased entirely. Mr. Tennyson glanced toward it, noted the hour's progression, and returned his attention to the sleeve. The second seam was progressing well, the stitches marching in neat rows along the fabric's edge, binding new to old with patient thoroughness. His back had begun to hold a faint ache from sitting, a familiar sensation that he acknowledged without particular concern. Later, when the work was done, he would stand and stretch, would bank the fire and extinguish the lamp, would climb the narrow stairs to his rooms above and settle into his own rest. But that time was not yet. The work had its own duration, and he would honor it. A sound from the street penetrated the shop's quiet, voices, young and slightly raised, passing in conversation. Mr. Tennyson's hands paused briefly as he listened, though he could not make out the words. The voices faded, absorbed by distance and fog, and the silence returned, perhaps deeper for having been briefly interrupted. He resumed his stitching, the needle catching lamplight with each upward pull, the thread sliding through fabric with its soft whisper. The room had grown warmer as the evening progressed, the combined heat of lamp and fire creating a comfortable atmosphere that made the shoulders relax and the breathing deepen. Mr. Tennyson felt the warmth settling into his bones, easing the day's minor stiffnesses, creating a pleasant drowsiness that existed alongside his concentration rather than opposing it. This was another gift of evening work. The way fatigue and focus could coexist, each tempering the other, producing a state of calm alertness that allowed the hours to pass without notice. The second sleeve was nearing completion now, the stitches reaching the point where sleeve met cuff, where the lining would be folded under and secured with a final careful seam. Mr. Tennyson worked methodically through this last section, his pace unchanged, giving these final stitches the same attention as those that had come before. There was no rushing toward completion, no eagerness to be finished. The work would end when it ended, and until that moment arrived, each stitch deserved its proper placement. He could feel the coat taking on new life beneath his hands, the transformation subtle but real. What had been damaged was becoming whole again, what had been worn was being renewed. This too was part of the work's satisfaction, this sense of restoration, of returning a useful object to its full function. Mr. Aldrich would wear this coat for several more years, would rely on it through countless mornings and evenings, would perhaps never think about the hours spent in lamplight repairing it. And that was as it should be. Good work disappeared into usefulness, required no acknowledgement beyond its continued service. The final stitch was placed, the thread knotted and trimmed close to the fabric. Mr. Tennyson held the sleeve up to the lamp, examining his work with a critical eye, checking for any irregularities, any points where the tension might be wrong or the alignment off. Finding none, he allowed himself a small nod of satisfaction. The sleeve was done, and done well. He laid it beside its companion, then reached for the coat's body, where the lining would need to be attached at several points to prevent it shifting during wear. This next phase required different stitches, small tacks that would catch the lining to the coat's interior seams without showing on the outside. He selected a slightly heavier needle, threaded it with doubled thread for strength, and began working his way along the coat's back seam. These stitches could be placed more quickly than the sleeve seams, though he maintained his careful pace, finding no reason to alter the evening's established rhythm. The fire in the grate had burned down considerably, the coals now a deep red fading to black at their edges, their light more subtle but somehow richer. Mr. Tennyson noted it peripherally, knowing he would need to add fuel soon if he wished to maintain the room's warmth, though the decision felt distant, something to address when the current task reached its natural pause. For now, the remaining heat was sufficient, and the lamp provided adequate light, and there was the coat before him requiring only this steady application of skill. His thoughts drifted to Mr. Aldrich, imagining the clerk's expression when he collected the repaired coat, the quiet pleasure of finding work done well, the relief of not needing to budget for a replacement garment. Mr. Aldrich was a man of modest means, his position secure but not lucrative, his expenses carefully managed. The coat represented a significant portion of his wardrobe, and its extended life would matter in ways both practical and personal. Mr. Tennyson understood this without needing to be told, recognized in Mr. Aldrich's careful treatment of his possessions a kinship of circumstance and outlook. The tacking progressed along the seam, each small stitch placed at intervals of 3 or 4 inches, enough to secure the lining without creating any stiffness in the coat's drape. Mr. Tennyson's hands moved with absolute certainty, finding the precise spots where needles should enter and emerge, working more by feel than sight, though the lamplight remained steady and clear. This was work that existed in that space between conscious attention and automatic action, requiring just enough focus to maintain quality while allowing the mind to rest in a kind of mobile meditation. Outside, the city's sounds had diminished further, the hour growing late enough that even the public houses had quieted, their patrons dispersed to homes or other destinations. The fog would make walking treacherous, turning familiar streets into uncertain passages, but this was London, and its inhabitants had long since learned to navigate its moods and weathers. Mr. Tennyson imagined them moving through the grey, collars turned up, hands thrust deep in pockets, finding their way by memory and the occasional gas lamp's muted glow. It was a city of such journeys, thousands occurring simultaneously, each person carrying their own purposes and preoccupations through the night. But here, in the shop, such movements felt very distant, belonging to a world that existed beyond the lamp's circle of light. Here there was only the coat, the thread, the needle's gentle repetition. The work had become almost dreamlike in its quality, each stitch flowing into the next without clear boundaries, time marked only by the gradual progress of seam work rather than by the clock's measured chimes. Mr. Tennyson reached the coat's hem, where the final tacks would secure the lining's lower edge. He worked these stitches with particular care, ensuring they would withstand the stress of movement without pulling free. The thread was strong, the knots secure, the placement deliberate. When the last stitch was tied off and trimmed, he set down his needle and lifted the coat, holding it up to examine the whole. The garment hung properly now, the lining visible only when the coat was opened, the interior as neat and well finished as the exterior. He turned the sleeves right side out, smoothed the fabric with his palm, felt the satisfactory weight and drape of the repaired coat. It was good work, honest work, the kind that would serve its purpose quietly and well for years to come. Mr. Tennyson folded the coat carefully, wrapping it in clean muslin to protect it until collection, and set it aside on the shelf reserved for completed repairs. The evening's primary task was finished, though the night was not yet done. He glanced at the clock and saw that several hours remained before his usual retirement. The shop felt particularly peaceful now, the work complete, the pressure of unfinished tasks lifted. He could have closed up, could have sought his bed, but something in the evening's quality made him reluctant to break its spell. Instead, he rose from his stool, feeling his joints protest mildly at the movement, and crossed to the fire. A few pieces of coal remained in the scuttle. He added them to the grate with careful placement, ensuring good air flow, watching as the coals caught and began to glow with renewed vigor. The additional warmth was welcome, spreading through the room and easing the slight chill that had crept in during his absorption in work. He returned to his stool but did not immediately take up another task. Instead, he sat quietly, hands resting on his knees, allowing himself simply to be present in the shop's evening calm. The lamp continued its steady burn, the flame dancing minutely in currents of air too subtle to feel. The fire crackled softly as the new coal caught. The clock ticked its patient measure. These sounds, so familiar as to usually pass beneath notice, seemed tonight to possess a particular clarity, each one distinct and somehow significant, small notes in an ongoing composition of which this evening was but one movement. Mr. Tennyson's gaze moved slowly around the room, taking in each detail as though seeing it anew, the measuring tape coiled on its hook, the cushion on the window seat worn smooth by years of customers waiting, the sample book of buttons open to a page displaying horn and bone varieties. Each object held its own history, its own accumulation of moments and purposes, and together they formed the texture of his daily life, the familiar landscape through which he moved with barely conscious navigation. His hands, resting on his knees, bore the marks of his trade, the callus on his right middle finger where the needle pressed, the faint scars from occasional slips of blade or pin, the slight thickening of the joints from years of precise repetitive motion. These were working hands, shaped by their labor, and he regarded them without sentiment but with a kind of acknowledgement, a recognition of the partnership between mind and body that made his craft possible. Outside, the fog showed no signs of lifting. If anything, it had grown denser, pressing more heavily against the windows, muffling what few sounds remained in the street. The shop felt increasingly isolated, a small island of warmth and light in a gray sea, and Mr. Tennyson found this sensation oddly comforting. There was safety in this separation, a permission to simply exist without reference to the larger world's demands. The evening had reached that quality of time where minutes seemed to stretch and blur, where the distinction between one moment and the next grew less defined. The lamp burned, the fire glowed, and Mr. Tennyson sat in his accustomed place, surrounded by the tools and materials of his trade, content in the particular peace that comes from work completed and the evening's gentle progression toward rest. He thought, briefly, of taking up some small task, perhaps sorting buttons or organizing thread, but the thought passed without urgency. There would be time enough for such work tomorrow, and the evening seemed to call instead for this quiet sitting, this simple presence without agenda or purpose beyond being here, now, in this moment of calm. The shop breathed around him, its timbers settling with small creaks, its walls holding their steady vigil against the night. This building had stood for decades, had housed other tailors before him, would likely house others after. Yet for now it was his, this small domain of cloth and thread, of careful workmanship and unhurried hours. The knowledge sat lightly on him, neither burden nor particular source of pride, simply a fact woven into the fabric of his existence as thoroughly as the stitches he had just completed were woven into Mr. Aldrich's coat. The clock chimed the hour, its sound familiar and somehow reassuring, marking the night's progression with mechanical faithfulness. Mr. Tennyson heard it, acknowledged it, then let it fade back into the general quiet. Time was passing, as it always did, but here in the lamp's circle it seemed to move at a different pace, patient and unhurried, measured not in minutes but in the slow burning of oil, the gradual cooling of coals, the gentle accumulation of stillness. He shifted slightly on his stool, easing his back, and his gaze fell on the cabinet where he kept his fabric samples. Each drawer held its own collection. Wool in various weights and weaves, cotton both plain and figured, linen for summer waistcoats, silk for special occasions. He knew the contents of each drawer without needing to check, could locate any sample by feel alone, had handled these materials so often that they had become extensions of his understanding rather than separate objects requiring study. Tomorrow he would open the shop to daylight and customers, would measure and cut and discuss the minutiae of tailoring with those who came seeking his services. But that was tomorrow, a different time belonging to a different part of his life. Tonight belonged to this quiet sitting, to the lamp's glow and the fire's warmth, to the satisfaction of work completed and the gentle emptiness that follows focused labor. The fog continued its press against the windows, unchanging, a gray presence that seemed almost companionable in its persistence. Mr. Tennyson watched the way it moved, or failed to move, against the glass, the small shifts and eddies made visible by the lamplight, hypnotic in their slow drift. His breathing had slowed to match the evening's pace, each breath drawn deep and released fully, his body settling into the kind of rest that comes not from sleep but from the absence of tension, the release of the day's accumulated holdings. He thought, in a distant way, that he should eventually rise, should prepare for true rest, but the thought held no urgency. The night had hours yet before dawn, and there was a comfort in simply sitting here, in this familiar space, surrounded by the tools and materials of his trade, the lamp burning its patient light, the fire offering its quiet warmth. This too was part of the work's rhythm, these moments of pause between completion and beginning, spaces where nothing in particular needed to happen and the simple fact of presence was sufficient. The shop held him gently, this space he had occupied for so many years, its walls familiar as his own skin, its sounds and smells and particular quality of light as much a part of him as memory or breath. He sat in its embrace, the evening deepening around him, time moving at its unhurried pace, and found in this moment a kind of peace that asked nothing of him beyond his quiet acceptance of its gift. The lamplight caught on the edge of a brass button lying near the lamp's base, causing it to gleam with a sudden small brilliance that drew Mr. Tennyson's eye. He reached for it absently, turning it between his fingers, feeling its weight and the smooth finish of its surface. It was a naval button, he saw, with an anchor embossed on its face, likely removed from some officer's coat during repair and then forgotten, left to rest on the table's edge where it had remained for weeks or perhaps months. Such small objects accumulated in a tailor's shop, each with its own fragmentary story, its connection to some larger narrative of use and purpose now severed. He set the button down again, placing it more deliberately this time, and his gaze drifted to the window where the fog pressed thickly against the glass. The street beyond had become entirely invisible, the world reduced to the dimensions of this single room, this pool of lamplight, this particular moment existing outside the usual flow of hours. There was something dreamlike in this isolation, though Mr. Tennyson remained fully alert, his thoughts clear even as they moved slowly, following their own unhurried paths. His mind turned to the work awaiting him in the coming days. There was Mr. Hartley's waistcoat, requiring new buttons and adjustment of the back strap, the gentleman having lost some weight in recent months. Mrs. Pemberton's son would be bringing his school uniform for lengthening, the boy having grown with that sudden swiftness of youth. And there were the usual small tasks. Hems to be adjusted, seams to be reinforced, tiers to be invisibly mended. Nothing urgent, nothing requiring particular creativity, simply the steady accumulation of work that formed the substance of his days. He found comfort in this predictability, in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring familiar tasks requiring familiar skills. There had been a time, years ago, when he had aspired to more elaborate work, had imagined creating fine coats for gentlemen of means, garments that would be remarked upon and admired. But those ambitions had settled into acceptance of his actual circumstances, and he had discovered a deeper satisfaction in work done well, regardless of its scope or recognition. The stitches he placed in Mr. Aldrich's lining were no less worthy of care than those that might grace a nobleman's coat, and the service he provided to his modest clientele was no less valuable for its lack of glamour. The fire had reached a steady state, the new coals integrated with the old, burning with a deep, even heat that radiated into the room without the initial intensity of fresh flame. Mr. Tennyson felt this warmth against his back and sides, a presence as reliable as the floor beneath his feet, as constant as the walls surrounding him. The shop had always been good at holding heat, the thick walls and low ceiling creating a space that, once warmed, maintained its temperature with minimal fuel. This too was a kind of blessing, making the winter months more bearable and reducing the cost of coal to manageable levels. His thoughts moved to the building itself, to the rooms above where he lived with a simplicity that matched his working space. The bedroom with its narrow bed and simple washstand, the sitting room with its 2 chairs and small table, the kitchen barely large enough to contain its stove and cupboard. These spaces asked little of him and provided what he needed, shelter and privacy and a separation between work and rest. He climbed to them each evening when the shop was closed, descended each morning to resume his labor, and in this daily rhythm found a structure that supported rather than confined. A slight sound drew his attention, barely audible but distinct in the room's quiet, a mouse, perhaps, moving behind the wainscoting, or simply the building's timbers adjusting to the night's temperature. Mr. Tennyson listened without alarm, familiar with the shop's various sounds, able to distinguish between those requiring attention and those that were simply part of the structure's life. This sound fell into the latter category, a small voice in the building's ongoing conversation with itself, and he let it pass without concern. His hands, still resting on his knees, had grown cool despite the fire's warmth. He flexed them slowly, feeling the joints protest mildly, then brought them together, palm against palm, warming them with their combined heat. This was another aspect of the tailor's experience, this constant awareness of hands, their temperature and flexibility, their readiness for the detailed work they performed. Cold hands meant clumsy fingers, missed stitches, work that would need to be undone and repeated. He had learned long ago to attend to such practical matters, to maintain the conditions that allowed for good work. The clock ticked steadily, its mechanism hidden within its wooden case, its face showing the hour's progress with hands that moved too slowly to perceive yet never ceased their advancement. Mr. Tennyson glanced at it and saw that the evening had moved deeper into night, though the hour was not yet so late as to require immediate retirement. There remained this space, this interval between work's completion and sleep's commencement, and he felt no urgency to collapse it, to rush toward the day's end. Instead, he rose from his stool with the slow deliberation of one who has sat for many hours, feeling each vertebra realign as he straightened, hearing the soft pops and creaks of joints finding their full extension. He walked to the window, not to look out, the fog prevented any view, but simply to stand in a different part of the room, to allow his body the variation of position and perspective. The window glass was cold to the touch when he placed his palm against it, the heat of the room meeting the chill of the night in that thin barrier. He could feel the temperature difference distinctly, could sense the fog's damp presence just beyond the glass, waiting with patient persistence. In the morning it might have lifted, might have yielded to sun or wind, or it might cling on through the day, turning London into a muffled, close-pressed world where distances were measured in paces and the familiar became strange. He moved away from the window, crossing the room to stand before the cabinet that held his threads. The drawers were arranged by color, each shade given its own compartment, the contents visible through the glass-fronted upper portion. The colors formed a spectrum, moving from white through cream and tan to brown and black, with separate sections for the more unusual shades, deep blue, dark green, burgundy. Each spool represented hours of work, miles of thread drawn through countless pieces of fabric, and together they formed a kind of archive of his labor, a physical record of repairs and alterations performed across the years. He opened one drawer, running his fingers across the spools, feeling their different textures. The smooth silk, the slightly rougher cotton, the substantial linen. Each had its appropriate use, its particular qualities that made it suited for specific tasks. The silk for fine finish work, the cotton for strength and durability, the linen for buttons and heavy seams. He had learned these distinctions through practice and occasional error, had come to know them so thoroughly that selection had become instinctive. Closing the drawer, he moved to the dress form standing in the corner. It was an old piece, its canvas covering faded and marked with countless pinholes, its wooden base scuffed and worn. Yet it remained serviceable, maintaining the shape it had been given decades ago, a silent partner in the work of fitting and adjusting garments. He rested his hand on its shoulder, feeling the firm padding beneath the fabric, and thought of all the coats and waistcoats that had been draped over this form, all the adjustments made and checked against its unchanging dimensions. The room around him felt particularly present tonight, each object seeming to assert its existence with unusual clarity. The scissors hanging from their hook, their blades crossed in waiting. The pincushion with its collection of pins, each one placed there after use, ready for the next need. The iron resting on its stand, cold now but holding the ghost memory of countless pressing sessions, fabric smoothed beneath its weight and heat. These were his companions, the tools through which his skill found expression, and he regarded them with the quiet appreciation one might feel for reliable friends. He returned to his stool, settling onto it with a familiar adjustment of weight and posture. The fire continued its steady burn, the lamp its unwavering glow. The fog pressed against the windows, the clock ticked its patient measure, and the evening held its particular quality of suspended time, neither advancing nor retreating but simply existing in its own gentle duration. Mr. Tennyson's thoughts had grown quieter still, the earlier threads of reflection about work and routine now fading into a more general state of restful awareness. He was simply here, in this place he knew so well, at this hour he had occupied countless times before, and there was a sufficiency in this that required no additional meaning or purpose. His breathing had deepened further, each breath drawn fully into his lungs, then released completely, the rhythm slow and regular. The warmth of the room, the comfort of his familiar seat, the day's labors completed. All of these combined to create a state of profound relaxation that existed just this side of sleep. He was not drowsy exactly, but rather settled into a deep calm, his body at ease, his mind quiet, the usual pressures and concerns of daily life temporarily suspended. The lamp flame wavered slightly, responding to some current of air too subtle to feel, and Mr. Tennyson watched its small movement with the absorbed attention one might give to falling snow or flowing water. There was something hypnotic in the flame's gentle dance, the way it maintained its essential form while constantly shifting, never quite still yet never departing from its central purpose. The glass chimney protected it from the room's drafts while allowing air to feed its burn, a simple technology perfected over centuries, reliable and sufficient. He thought, In a distant way, about the oil in the lamp's reservoir, trying to estimate how much remained, how many more hours of light it might provide. But the thought was vague, unimportant, just another small consideration drifting through the quiet of his mind. The lamp would burn as long as it burned, and when the oil was exhausted, darkness would claim the room and he would retire to his bed above. Until then, there was simply this: the light, the warmth, the stillness. The shop settled around him, its walls holding their steady presence, its contents arranged in the familiar order he maintained through daily habit. Everything had its place, everything was known, and this order created a kind of peace, a small domain of predictability in a world that often felt chaotic and uncertain. Within these walls, he understood the rules and rhythms, knew what was required and how to provide it, and this knowledge formed the foundation of his contentment. His gaze moved to the ceiling, following the lines of the beams, noting the places where the plaster had cracked over time, creating fine lines that spread like bare branches against winter sky. These cracks had been there for years, gradually extending, forming new patterns, a slow process he observed without concern. The ceiling remained sound, the cracks merely cosmetic, evidence of the building's age and the natural settling that occurred over decades of use. Time continued its passage, marked by the clock's steady ticking, by the slow consumption of coal and lamp oil, by the gradual shift in the quality of the night beyond the windows. Mr. Tennyson sat within this progression, neither resisting nor hastening it, simply allowing it to unfold according to its own nature. There was nowhere he needed to be, nothing he needed to do, and this freedom from obligation felt like a luxury, a rare gift in a life structured around duty and routine. The fire's warmth had spread throughout the room now, eliminating the last traces of chill, creating a comfortable atmosphere that encouraged the muscles to relax, the breathing to slow. Mr. Tennyson felt this warmth penetrating his clothes, reaching his skin, seeping into the deeper layers where tension sometimes gathered and persisted. His shoulders, which often held tightness from the day's detailed work, had softened completely. His hands, usually engaged in constant small movements, rested motionless on his knees. He became aware of the silence in a new way, not as the absence of sound but as its own kind of presence, a quality that filled the room as surely as light or warmth. It was not absolute silence, there were still the fire's occasional shifts, the clock's ticking, his own quiet breathing. But these sounds seemed to deepen rather than break the fundamental stillness, like stones dropped into still water, their ripples expanding and then fading back into calm. His eyelids had grown heavy, though he did not close them entirely, maintaining instead a half-focused gaze that took in the room without concentrating on any particular detail. The lamplight created soft shadows in the corners, gentle gradations from brightness to darkness that suggested depth and dimension. The fire's glow added a warmer tone to the light, tinting surfaces with subtle orange, creating a layered illumination that felt both natural and comforting. Somewhere distant, beyond the shop's walls and the fog's thick presence, a dog barked once, then fell silent. The sound reached Mr. Tennyson as if from another world, a brief reminder that life continued beyond his small island of lamplight and calm. But the reminder did not disturb his peace, merely acknowledged it, and then faded away, leaving the room's quiet intact. He thought about the coat he had just repaired, imagining it hanging in Mr. Aldrich's modest wardrobe, waiting to be worn again, to resume its service. The coat would remember nothing of tonight's work, would bear no conscious mark of the hours spent in lamplight, carefully attended to. Yet it would carry those hours nonetheless, in the strength of its seams, in the smoothness of its lining, in the extended usefulness it would provide. This seemed right to Mr. Tennyson, this idea that good work should disappear into function, should serve without calling attention to itself. The evening had reached a point of perfect equilibrium, all its elements balanced, the fire neither too hot nor too cool, the lamp neither too bright nor too dim, the silence neither oppressive nor empty. Mr. Tennyson existed within this balance, part of it rather than separate from it, his presence adding to rather than disturbing the room's particular harmony. His mind had grown very quiet now, thoughts arising and dissolving like mist, leaving barely a trace of their passage. There was the awareness of sitting, of warmth, of light, of the gentle pressure of his body against the stool, of his hands resting on his knees. These sensations formed the substance of his experience, simple and immediate, requiring no interpretation or response. The clock chimed the quarter hour, its sound familiar and undemanding, simply marking time's passage without insisting on any particular significance. Mr. Tennyson heard it and let it go, the chime fading back into the general quiet like a ripple disappearing into still water. He shifted slightly on his stool, a minimal adjustment of posture, feeling the slight protest of muscles held in position, then the ease as they found a new arrangement. The stool beneath him was solid and reliable, its seat worn smooth by years of use, conforming to his shape through patient accommodation. It was a simple piece of furniture, functional rather than elegant, yet it served its purpose perfectly, and he felt a quiet appreciation for its steady presence. The fog beyond the windows showed no sign of thinning, its gray presence unchanged, patient and persistent. Mr. Tennyson had long since ceased to think of it as an impediment, accepting instead its role in creating this particular evening's quality, the way it enclosed the shop in its own small world, separate from the city's usual connections and flows. Tomorrow might bring clarity, might restore the usual views and pathways, but tonight belonged to this gray isolation, this intimate containment. His breathing continued its slow rhythm, deep and regular, each breath carrying with it a sense of release, of letting go. There was nothing to hold, nothing to maintain, nothing requiring his active attention. The work was done, the evening was unfolding according to its own gentle logic, and he could simply be here, present and at ease, without agenda or expectation. The lamp flame continued its small dance, the fire its steady glow, the clock its patient ticking. These constant elements formed a kind of rhythm, a background pulse against which his own stillness rested. He was aware of them without focusing on them, the way one might be aware of one's own heartbeat, a presence that required no conscious attention yet provided a foundation for all other experience. Time moved through the room like water through rock, slowly and without obvious progression, yet undeniably advancing, carrying the evening deeper into night. Mr. Tennyson moved with it, or perhaps remained still while it flowed around him, the distinction unclear and unimportant. There was only this moment, endlessly renewing itself, the lamp burning, the fire glowing, the fog pressing gently against the windows, and himself sitting quietly in the midst of it all, a point of calm awareness in the soft embrace of evening. The warmth from the fire had settled into every corner of the room now, a gentle, pervasive presence that seemed to soften the very air. Mr. Tennyson sat without movement, his body having found a position of complete ease, his weight distributed evenly on the stool, his spine aligned in a way that required no muscular effort to maintain. This was the state his body naturally sought after hours of detailed work, a kind of effortless rest that allowed every joint and muscle to release its accumulated tension. His gaze, still unfocused and soft, rested on the cutting table before him. The surface bore the marks of countless years, faint chalk lines that had never quite erased, small scratches from blades and pins, the subtle depression worn into the wood where he most often worked. These marks formed a kind of map, a record of labor that could be read by those who knew how to look, though to most eyes the table would appear simply old and well-used. Mr. Tennyson saw in its surface the accumulation of days, each mark a moment of concentration, each worn spot 1,000 small actions repeated until they became habit, then nature. The measuring tape lay coiled near the table's edge, its fabric marked with numbers in fading black ink. He had used this tape for so many years that he no longer needed to read the markings for common measurements, his fingers knowing by feel the distance between 1 inch and another, his eye able to judge within a 1/4 inch simply by looking. This knowledge had been earned slowly, through patient practice and occasional error, and it resided not in his conscious mind but in the deeper layers of understanding that came from extended repetition. Beyond the table, the shelves held their orderly contents, each bolt of fabric wrapped in paper to protect it from dust and light. The papers were labeled in his own careful hand, notations made when the fabric was purchased, sometimes years ago. Some bolts had diminished considerably over time, their contents used for various repairs and small projects, while others remained largely intact, waiting for the right purpose, the appropriate need. Mr. Tennyson knew the contents of each package without needing to unwrap them, could recall where and when each fabric had been acquired, what he had paid for it, what projects he envisioned it might serve. This knowledge formed a kind of internal ledger, a mental accounting that existed alongside the physical record kept in his books. He understood his inventory not merely as objects but as possibilities, each length of fabric holding the potential to become something useful and well-made. The brown wool might become a gentleman's coat, the gray worsted a waistcoat, the black serge a pair of trousers. These transformations had not yet occurred, existed only as latent possibilities, but they were no less real for their unmanifest state. The lamp continued its steady burn, the wick drawing oil from the reservoir with patient consistency, converting it to light and a small amount of heat. Mr. Tennyson watched the flame without thinking about it, the way one might watch clouds moving across sky or leaves drifting on water. There was something endlessly fascinating in the flame's movement, the way it maintained its essential shape while constantly shifting, responding to currents of air too subtle to be otherwise perceived. His hands had warmed now, the earlier coolness dissipated by the fire's heat and the stillness of his position. He flexed his fingers slowly, feeling the joints move smoothly, the muscles respond without stiffness. These hands had sewn thousands of seams, placed millions of stitches, handled fabrics ranging from coarse canvas to delicate silk. They bore the evidence of this labor in their calluses and scars, in the slight thickening of certain joints, in the particular strength of the muscles that controlled needle and thread. Yet they were not large hands, nor particularly powerful in the conventional sense. Their strength was specific, adapted to the precise movements required by tailoring, the ability to maintain steady pressure while drawing thread through resistant fabric, the dexterity to manipulate needle and cloth simultaneously, the sensitivity to feel the exact tension needed for each type of stitch. These were specialized skills, developed over decades, and Mr. Tennyson regarded his hands with a kind of gratitude for their faithful service. The fire shifted again, one of the coals breaking apart, settling into a new configuration. The sound was soft, barely audible, but in the room's quiet it registered clearly, a small event in the evening's otherwise unchanging landscape. Mr. Tennyson glanced toward the grate, noted the fire's steady burn, then let his gaze drift back to its previous unfocused state. Time had become difficult to judge, the usual markers obscured by the evening's particular quality. The clock continued to tick and chime, providing objective measurement, yet these sounds seemed to come from a distance, as though belonging to a different order of reality than the one Mr. Tennyson currently inhabited. He existed in a slower time, measured not by minutes but by breaths, by the gradual cooling of coals and consumption of lamp oil, by the gentle progression from one moment of stillness to the next. His thoughts, such as they were, had simplified considerably, reduced to basic observations and sensations. The warmth against his back. The light falling across the table. The softness of his own breathing. These simple facts formed the entirety of his awareness, and there was a completeness in this simplicity, a sense that nothing additional was needed or wanted. The shop around him held its familiar arrangement, every object in its accustomed place. The scissors on their hook, the thimble on the table, the buttons in their box, the thread in its cabinet. This order was the product of years of habit, each item returned to its place after use, maintained in readiness for the next need. It was an order that required minimal effort to maintain once established, simply the discipline of putting things back where they belonged, of treating objects with care and respect. Mr. Tennyson had learned this discipline from his master, the tailor who had trained him as a young man. That man had been exacting in his standards, insistent that good work required not only skill but also organization, that a disordered workspace led inevitably to disordered work. At the time, Mr. Tennyson had sometimes chafed under these requirements, had thought them fussy and unnecessary. But time had proven their wisdom, had shown him how much easier work became when tools were reliably located, when materials were properly stored, when the workspace maintained its clarity and order. He could picture his master now, though the man had been dead these 20 years, could recall the particular way he had held his needle, the angle at which he cut fabric, the small sounds of approval or dissatisfaction he made while examining work. These memories were faint now, worn smooth by time, yet they remained, woven into the fabric of Mr. Tennyson's own practice, visible in his techniques and habits even when he no longer consciously thought of their origin. The fog beyond the windows seemed, if anything, to have grown thicker still, pressing more closely against the glass, though this might have been merely a trick of perception, the evening's depth making the gray appear more substantial. Mr. Tennyson no longer looked toward the windows, his attention having turned fully inward, toward the room and his own quiet presence within it. His breathing had slowed even further, each breath a long, gentle movement, barely disturbing the stillness of his posture. The air he drew in carried the scents of the shop, coal smoke, lamp oil, wool and cotton, the faint tang of the wax he used on thread. These smells were so familiar as to usually pass unnoticed, but in his current state of relaxed awareness they registered distinctly, each one contributing to the particular atmosphere that made this place what it was. The clock chimed the half-hour, its sound penetrating the quiet and then fading, leaving behind a stillness that seemed deeper for having been briefly interrupted. Mr. Tennyson noted the time without particular interest, the knowledge registering but not prompting any action or decision. The evening would continue until it reached its natural conclusion, and he would remain here, in this state of calm attendance, until that moment arrived. His eyelids had grown heavier still, though he maintained them at half-mast, allowing just enough light to enter that the room remained visible, the lamp's glow a soft presence in his dimmed vision. The line between waking and sleep had become unclear, his state one of deep rest that partook of both conditions without fully belonging to either. He was aware of the room, of his body, of the passage of time, yet this awareness was dreamlike, distant, requiring no effort to maintain. The stool beneath him felt perfectly stable, a solid point of contact with the physical world, grounding him even as his consciousness drifted in this state between sleep and waking. His hands remained on his knees, their weight slight but perceptible, another anchor to the present moment. These simple points of contact formed a foundation, allowing his mind to rest while his body maintained its upright position. The fire's warmth continued to radiate through the room, creating a temperature that was neither too hot nor too cool, but exactly suited to ease and comfort. Mr. Tennyson felt this warmth as a kind of embrace, gentle and supportive, asking nothing of him, simply providing the conditions in which rest became possible. His muscles had released completely now, holding only the minimum tension needed to keep him upright, everything else surrendered to gravity and stillness. The lamp flame wavered again, responding to some infinitesimal current, its shadow dancing briefly across the table before settling back to near stillness. Mr. Tennyson watched this movement with the barest attention, his focus so diffused that the flame was simply one element among many in his field of vision, no more or less significant than the table beneath it or the shadows around it. Time continued its mysterious passage, the clock marking minutes and quarter hours that accumulated into an evening now grown deep into night. The city beyond the shop's walls had fallen into its own rhythms, the last pedestrians long since home, the public houses closed, even the most persistent revelers dispersed to their various destinations. Only the night workers remained abroad. Watchmen making their rounds, bakers beginning the long process that would produce morning bread, the occasional cab driver hoping for a late fare. But these activities occurred in a different world, one that did not penetrate the fog-enclosed stillness of the tailor's shop. Mr. Tennyson existed in his small island of lamplight and warmth, separate from the city's ongoing life, present only to this moment and this place. The work he had completed earlier in the evening felt distant now, belonging to a different time, though the evidence of it remained in the wrapped coat on its shelf. Tomorrow he would return to such work, would take up needle and thread and resume his familiar tasks. But tomorrow existed in the future, beyond the current moment's boundary, and required no attention or concern. His body had settled into a state of profound relaxation, each breath so slow and gentle that it barely moved his chest, his heartbeat steady and quiet, his blood flowing with unhurried ease through veins and arteries. This physical calm supported and deepened his mental quiet, the two aspects of his being working together to create a state of complete rest that nevertheless remained distinct from sleep. The room around him seemed to participate in this stillness, its various objects resting in their places with the same patient calm. The scissors hung motionless on their hook, the cabinet stood solid against the wall, the dress form maintained its silent watch in the corner. Everything was exactly as it should be, nothing required adjustment or attention, and this rightness created a kind of peace that permeated the entire space. Mr. Tennyson's thoughts had become so sparse and slow that to call them thoughts seemed almost inaccurate. They were more like faint wisps of awareness, barely formed before dissolving, leaving behind only the most basic sense of presence and observation. He was here, in this place, at this time, and this simple fact formed the entirety of his conscious experience. The lamp continued its patient burn, the oil in its reservoir slowly diminishing though hours remained before it would run dry. The wick drew steadily, the flame converted fuel to light with reliable efficiency, and the glass chimney kept the flame protected while allowing its brightness to illuminate the room. It was a simple technology, perfected over generations, and it performed its function with the quiet competence that Mr. Tennyson valued in all things. His gaze, still soft and unfocused, had settled on a point somewhere in the middle distance, not looking at anything in particular but simply resting, the way one's eyes might rest when staring at a blank wall or an empty sky. The shapes and colors of the room registered in his peripheral vision, forming a stable background that required no active interpretation, simply existing as the familiar context of his awareness. The fire in the grate had burned down somewhat, the coals now showing more red than orange, their heat still substantial but gentler, no longer the initial intensity of fresh flame. This gradual cooling was part of the fire's natural progression, something Mr. Tennyson had observed countless times, and he watched it now with the same patient acceptance he brought to all predictable processes. His hands, resting on his knees, had grown warm enough that he could feel the heat radiating from his palms, a pleasant sensation that added to his overall comfort. The fabric of his trousers beneath his hands was smooth and slightly worn, the wool having softened with age and use. These small tactile details registered in his awareness without demanding attention, simply present as part of the moment's texture. The evening had reached a depth that seemed bottomless, a quality of time that suggested it might continue indefinitely, though Mr. Tennyson knew intellectually that dawn would eventually come, that this night, like all nights, would give way to morning. But that knowledge existed somewhere distant from his current experience, which felt suspended outside the usual flow of hours, existing in its own particular duration. His breathing continued its gentle rhythm, so slow and quiet that it seemed almost to have stopped, though air continued to move in and out of his lungs with patient regularity. This breath sustained him, carried oxygen to his blood, removed waste, performed all the necessary functions of life without requiring any conscious direction or effort. It simply happened, as it had happened since his birth and would continue until his death, a fundamental process so reliable as to usually pass completely unnoticed. The clock ticked on, its mechanism steady and precise, each tick identical to the one before, each second measured with mechanical accuracy. Yet in Mr. Tennyson's current state, these identical moments seemed to expand and blur, losing their distinct boundaries, flowing into one another like water seeking its level. Time was passing, yet it also seemed to be standing still, a paradox that his conscious mind might have found troubling but which his current state simply accepted without question. The lamp flame danced its small dance, the fire glowed its steady glow, and Mr. Tennyson sat in his accustomed place, a figure at rest, surrounded by the tools and materials of his trade, present to this moment of deep quiet in a way that asked nothing and offered everything. The evening held him gently, the shop embraced him with its familiar walls, and the night continued its patient progression toward an ending that seemed, in this moment, infinitely distant and entirely inevitable at once. The stillness had deepened to a quality that seemed almost tangible, as though the air itself had thickened into something that could be felt as well as breathed. Mr. Tennyson remained in his position on the stool, his body having achieved a state of rest so complete that movement seemed not merely unnecessary but almost impossible, as though he had become part of the shop's permanent fixtures, no more likely to shift than the table or the cabinet. His awareness had narrowed to the most basic sensations, the pressure of the stool beneath him, the warmth of the fire against his back, the soft glow of lamplight against his half-closed eyelids. These sensations formed the entire content of his consciousness, simple and immediate, requiring no interpretation or response. He existed within them as a fish exists within water, so thoroughly immersed that the boundary between self and surroundings had grown indistinct. The clock chimed the 3/4 hour, its sound arriving as if from a great distance, penetrating the room's quiet and then fading away, leaving behind ripples of silence that gradually smoothed back to stillness. Mr. Tennyson heard it without counting, without marking the time in any deliberate way. The chime was simply another event in the evening's slow procession, no more or less significant than the fire's occasional shift or the lamp's steady burn. His hands on his knees had grown so still that he had almost ceased to feel them, the sensation of touch fading into a kind of absence, as though the boundary where his skin met fabric had dissolved. This was not numbness exactly, but rather a state in which sensation became so constant and unchanging that it no longer registered as distinct from the general field of awareness. The hands were there, he knew, but they had become part of the larger stillness rather than separate objects requiring attention. The shop's contents remained in their familiar positions, each object occupying its accustomed space with the permanence of long habit. The measuring tape on its hook, the pincushion on the table, the bolts of fabric on their shelves. All were exactly where they should be, creating an order so complete and reliable that it required no maintenance, no adjustment, no thought. This order was simply the way things were, had been, and would continue to be, a stable foundation beneath the evening's quiet flow. Mr. Tennyson's thoughts, already sparse and slow, had thinned even further, becoming like the wisps of steam that rise from a kettle left too long on diminished heat. Barely visible, quickly dissipating, leaving behind only the faintest trace of their existence. He was not thinking in any active sense, merely existing in a state of minimal consciousness, aware but not actively attending, present but not engaged. The lamplight fell across the cutting table in patterns determined by the flame's position and the room's geometry, creating gradations of brightness that shifted imperceptibly as the flame moved in its small dance. These patterns were endlessly complex in their detail yet fundamentally simple in their nature, light radiating from a source, encountering objects, creating shadows. Mr. Tennyson's gaze rested on these patterns without analyzing them, simply allowing them to exist in his field of vision, part of the moment's texture. The fire had reached that stage of burning where the coals glowed with deep internal heat, their surfaces showing intricate patterns of red and black, like aerial views of some volcanic landscape. The heat they produced was steady and reliable, no longer the sharp intensity of fresh flame but something more sustained and gentle, a warmth that pervaded without overwhelming. Mr. Tennyson felt this warmth as a constant presence, so familiar now that it had become simply part of the room's atmosphere, as fundamental as the air itself. His breathing had slowed to the point where each breath took many seconds to complete, the inhalation a long, gentle drawing in, the exhalation an equally slow release. The pause between breaths had lengthened as well, moments of complete stillness where no air moved in or out, where his body rested in perfect suspension before the next breath began. This rhythm was far slower than his waking breath, approaching the pace of deep sleep, yet he remained conscious, aware of the room and his position within it. The fog beyond the windows maintained its thick presence, unchanged and unchanging, a gray wall that seemed to have achieved a kind of permanence, as though it had always been there and would always remain. The shop existed within this enclosure, separate from whatever world might lie beyond the fog's boundary, complete and self-contained. There was no sense of isolation in this, no feeling of being cut off or confined, but rather a kind of comfort, the security of clear boundaries and known space. Time continued its passage, though its movement had become so slow and subtle as to be almost imperceptible. The clock marked its mechanical measures, ticks accumulating into seconds, seconds into minutes, but these units seemed to have lost their meaning, becoming merely abstract markers in a duration that felt qualitatively different from normal time. Mr. Tennyson existed in this altered time, where moments expanded to accommodate depths of stillness that ordinary clock time could not measure. His eyelids had grown heavier still, his vision narrowing to a thin band of soft light and shadow, the room's details blurring into general shapes and tones. The lamp remained visible as a source of warm brightness, the table as a darker mass beneath it, but the specific objects and their precise arrangements had faded from distinct perception. He saw the room now as a painter might see it when squinting, all details sacrificed to the most basic relationships of light and dark, shape and space. The stool beneath him felt like an extension of his own body, its surface no longer a separate thing but simply the lower boundary of his being, the point where he met the floor. This sense of integration extended to everything he touched or felt, the air surrounding him, the warmth against his back, the floor beneath his feet. All of these ceased to be external objects and became instead aspects of a single, unified experience of being here, now, in this particular configuration of matter and awareness. His heartbeat, which he could feel faintly in his chest and throat, had slowed to match his breathing, a deep, steady pulse that seemed to mark time in a different way than the clock's mechanical ticking. This was organic time, biological time, the rhythm of a body at profound rest, its various systems synchronized in a state of minimal activity and maximum efficiency. Energy was conserved, renewal occurred, the constant work of maintaining life proceeding with quiet competence beneath the level of conscious awareness. The shop around him seemed to breathe with its own slow rhythm, the walls expanding and contracting minutely with changes in temperature and humidity, the floorboards settling under their long-held weight, the very structure of the building engaged in its own patient processes of existence and gradual transformation. These movements were too small and slow to be perceived directly, yet Mr. Tennyson felt them somehow, sensed the building's life as something continuous with his own, both of them participants in the same slow dance of matter and time. The fire's light had dimmed slightly, the coals burning down toward ash, though sufficient heat remained to keep the room comfortable. This gradual diminishment was natural and expected, part of the fire's progression from flame to ember to cold ash, a cycle Mr. Tennyson had observed countless times. He noted it without concern, content to let the fire follow its own course, knowing that when its heat was no longer needed, when the time came to retire, the embers would be banked or allowed to die completely, their task finished. His mind had entered a state that resembled meditation, though he had never studied such practices or consciously sought to achieve any particular mental condition. This state had arisen naturally from the evening's circumstances. The work completed, the hour late, the body tired but not exhausted, the surroundings familiar and safe. In this confluence of factors, consciousness had settled into a mode of simple presence, aware but not actively thinking, observing without analyzing, existing without striving. The lamp flame continued its small variations, expanding slightly as a draft provided more air, then contracting as the draft passed, its light correspondingly brightening and dimming though never straying far from its average brightness. These variations were part of the flame's nature, small fluctuations around a stable mean, and they created a subtle animation in the room's illumination, a gentle pulse that kept the light from becoming entirely static and lifeless. Mr. Tennyson's body had achieved a temperature equilibrium with the room, the heat from the fire balancing against the coolness of the air, his internal temperature regulation systems operating with minimal effort. This balance felt pleasant and comfortable, neither too warm nor too cool, the kind of physical ease that allowed attention to turn entirely away from bodily concerns and rest in simple being. The silence in the room had grown so complete that small sounds became distinctly audible. The faint hiss of the lamp's flame, the barely perceptible creak of cooling coals, the minute settling of the building's timbers. These sounds formed a kind of quiet music, each one contributing its note to an overall composition that was more felt than heard, a sonic atmosphere that supported rather than disturbed the prevailing stillness. His thoughts, In the rare moments when anything that could be called thought arose, were fragmentary and disconnected, images without narrative, sensations without interpretation. A memory of morning light through the shop window. The feeling of thread sliding through fabric. The sound of rain on the roof from some forgotten afternoon. These wisps of past experience drifted through his awareness and dissolved, leaving no trace, requiring no response, simply passing through the space of consciousness like clouds across an empty sky. The clock ticked on, patient and precise, each tick identical to every other tick, the mechanism indifferent to the quality of time it measured, concerned only with its mechanical duty of marking seconds into minutes into hours. Yet in Mr. Tennyson's experience, these measured units had lost their uniformity, some moments expanding to contain depths of stillness while others passed so quickly as to seem not to have occurred at all, time becoming elastic and irregular despite the clock's insistence on mechanical regularity. The room held its familiar arrangement, everything in its place, nothing disturbed or out of order. This order created a kind of visual silence, an absence of discord or disruption that allowed the eye to rest wherever it landed without encountering anything jarring or unexpected. The shop had achieved its own form of stillness, not through emptiness but through perfect organization, each object present and accounted for, contributing to the whole without demanding individual attention. Mr. Tennyson's spine maintained its upright alignment, the vertebrae stacked one upon another in their natural curve, supported by muscles that had learned through long practice how to hold this position with minimal effort. His head balanced at the top of this column, neither falling forward nor tilting back, finding the point of equilibrium where its weight was most efficiently supported. This alignment allowed for maximum rest while remaining seated, the body's wisdom expressed in posture rather than conscious thought. His hands on his knees had grown so warm from the fire's heat and the stillness of their position that he could feel a faint pulse of blood in his fingertips, a gentle throb that marked his heartbeat's rhythm. This pulse was barely perceptible, requiring great stillness to notice, but once noticed it became a point of focus, a small anchor to the present moment, a reminder of the body's ongoing life processes continuing beneath the surface of awareness. The fog beyond the windows seemed eternal now, as though it had always existed and would always exist, a permanent feature of the world rather than a temporary weather condition. The shop floated within this fog like a ship at anchor in a gray sea, secure in its position yet surrounded by mystery, the world beyond its walls unknowable and perhaps irrelevant, everything of importance contained within these four walls, beneath this ceiling, surrounding this lamp. Time had lost its forward momentum, becoming instead a kind of eternal present, each moment containing all moments, past and future collapsed into now. Mr. Tennyson existed in this eternal now, his memories and anticipations faded to near nothingness, leaving only the immediate experience of sitting here, breathing softly, feeling warmth and light, being alive in the most basic and fundamental sense. The lamp's oil continued to burn, the reservoir slowly emptying though hours of light remained. This gradual consumption was invisible to direct observation, apparent only when one considered the lamp's state at different times, comparing the oil level now to what it had been earlier, or what it would be later. But such comparisons required a kind of temporal thinking that Mr. Tennyson had left behind, his awareness confined to the present moment, content with what was rather than concerned with what had been or would be. His breathing continued, so slow and gentle that it seemed almost to have stopped, though of course it couldn't stop while life remained. Each breath was a small miracle of chemistry and physics, air drawn into lungs, oxygen extracted and absorbed into blood, carbon dioxide expelled, the process automatic and efficient, requiring no conscious guidance or effort. The body knew how to breathe, had always known, would continue knowing until its final moment, and Mr. Tennyson trusted this knowing completely. The fire glowed in the grate, the coals still showing red at their centers, radiating heat that spread through the room in invisible waves, warming air that rose and circulated, creating gentle currents that stirred dust motes too small to see, that moved against skin too softly to feel, that existed only as the most subtle presence, more theoretical than actual, yet undeniably real for all their insubstantiality. The evening held him in its gentle grasp, the shop embraced him with its familiar walls, and Mr. Tennyson sat in perfect stillness, a figure at rest, beyond thought, beyond time, existing in the pure simplicity of this moment, this breath, this quiet heartbeat of awareness in the soft darkness of a fog-bound night. The clock chimed the hour, its sound arriving from what seemed an impossible distance, as though it had traveled through layers of time rather than simply across the room. Mr. Tennyson heard it without counting the chimes, without marking what hour had arrived. The sound came and went, leaving behind a silence that felt deeper for having been briefly interrupted, a stillness that settled back over the room like snow falling on snow. His body had achieved a state of rest so profound that the boundary between waking and sleeping had become meaningless, a distinction without relevance. He was here, present, aware of the lamp's glow and the fire's warmth, yet this awareness required no effort, no active attention. It simply was, as the room was, as the night was, as his own breathing was, fundamental facts that existed without needing to be maintained or questioned. The lamp flame had steadied to near-perfect stillness, its small movements reduced to the barest flutter, a trembling so slight as to be almost imagined. The light it cast had taken on a quality of permanence, as though it had always been falling across this table in exactly this way, would always continue to fall, unchanging and eternal. The shadows it created had likewise achieved a kind of fixity, dark shapes that seemed painted onto the walls and floor rather than being temporary absences of light. Mr. Tennyson's thoughts had thinned to nothing, leaving behind only the most basic sense of being, of existing in this place at this moment. There was no narrative to his consciousness, no story being told, no problems being solved or plans being made. There was only the fact of sitting here, of breathing, of being warmed by fire and illuminated by lamplight, and this fact required nothing beyond its own simple existence. The fire in the grate had burned down to its quietest stage, the coals glowing with a deep red that seemed to come from within rather than being mere surface phenomenon. They radiated warmth without flame, heat without light, their substance slowly transforming into ash while their energy dispersed into the surrounding air. This transformation was patient and thorough, nothing hurried, nothing forced, simply the natural progression from one state to another. His hands on his knees had become so still that he could no longer feel where they ended and his legs began, the two merged into a single continuous presence, warm and supported and requiring no attention. His feet on the floor had likewise lost their distinctness, becoming simply the lower extent of his being, the point where he met the earth, grounded and stable and entirely at rest. The shop around him held its patient vigil, walls and ceiling and floor forming an enclosure that was both physical shelter and something more, a container for this particular quality of time and awareness, a space set apart from the world's usual demands and expectations. Within these walls, nothing was required, nothing needed doing, and this freedom from obligation created a peace so complete it was almost palpable. The fog beyond the windows maintained its thick presence, neither advancing nor retreating, simply existing as the boundary of the known world. Beyond it lay London, vast and complex, filled with lives and stories and the endless churn of human activity. But that world felt infinitely distant, separated from this small room not merely by fog but by something more fundamental, a difference in the very nature of time and being. Mr. Tennyson sat in his stillness, breath moving so slowly it seemed barely to disturb the air, heartbeat marking time with a patience that matched the clock's ticking, his consciousness reduced to its most essential core, simple awareness, simple presence, simple being. The evening had brought him to this place of profound rest, this state that asked nothing and offered everything, and he existed within it completely, without reservation or resistance. The lamp would burn until its oil was exhausted, the fire would glow until the last coal crumbled to ash, and he would sit here in this stillness until the natural moment arrived to rise, to bank the embers, to extinguish the light, to climb the narrow stairs to his bed above. But that moment had not yet come, and until it did, there was only this, the quiet, the warmth, the gentle persistence of breath and heartbeat, the soft glow of lamplight in a fog-bound room where time had slowed to the pace of sleep itself. And so the evening continued, patient and unhurried, the tailor at rest among his tools and materials, the city hidden beyond grey walls of fog, the night holding everything in its soft embrace. The lamp burned steadily, the fire glowed its quiet glow, and stillness settled over the shop like a blessing, gentle and complete. Thank you for joining me tonight in this quiet corner of Victorian London. If these soothing stories help you drift off to rest, you might consider subscribing to Mystic Sleep Tales and perhaps mentioning in the comments where you listen to them or which peaceful corner of the past you'd like to visit next. But for now, just rest. Let the mist envelop you, the lamplight fade, and sleep find you in its gentle time. Remember, tomorrow is the first day of the rest of your life. Good night.